Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel where we explore the strange, the forgotten, and the wonderfully mundane corners of history. Tonight, we're diving into something that might just lull you into the most peaceful sleep you've had in weeks. We're talking about fashion trends so bizarre, so utterly impractical, that you'll wonder how anyone managed to walk, sit, or even breathe while wearing them. So before we begin this gentle journey through centuries of questionable clothing choices, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy this kind of content, and subscribe if you want more relaxing historical deep dives, and let me know in the comments what time it is where you are, and whether you're using this to fall asleep or just to unwind. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together through the oddest fashion trends in human history. Picture this. You're getting dressed for an important social gathering in 15th century Europe. But instead of slipping on a simple outfit, you're about to spend the next 2 hours being laced, pinned, and essentially constructed into your clothing. Because fashion, as it turns out, has always been less about comfort and more about making a statement. And some of those statements were truly bewildering. Throughout history, humans have done remarkable things in the name of style. We've worn shoes that made walking nearly impossible, headpieces that required architectural support, and clothing so restrictive that basic bodily functions became strategic planning exercises. These weren't just occasional oddities worn by eccentric individuals. These were widespread trends that entire societies embraced, sometimes for decades or even centuries. Tonight, we're going to explore these fashion phenomena with the gentle pace they deserve. No rushing, no dramatic reveals, just a slow, methodical journey through the wardrobes of our ancestors, because there's something deeply soothing about examining the past without judgment, understanding that every generation has its own peculiar relationship with appearance and status. Our first stop takes us to medieval Europe, where pointed shoes became such an obsession that they required their own legislation. These weren't just slightly pointed shoes, snoop. We're talking about footwear with toes so elongated they sometimes measured longer than the foot itself. The style was called poulain, and they represented one of fashion's first truly impractical mass movements. The longer the point, the higher your social status. Nobles wore shoes with toes that curled upward and had to be supported by whalebone or stuffed with material to maintain their shape. Some were so long they were chained to the wearer's knees to prevent tripping. Imagine trying to navigate a crowded marketplace or climb a flight of stairs while essentially wearing foot stilts that extended a foot beyond your actual toes. The trend became so extreme that various governments felt compelled to intervene. Laws were passed limiting the length of shoe points based on social class. Commoners could have points up to 6 inches, merchants could go up to 12 inches, and only nobility could wear the truly extravagant lengths. It's remarkable to think that medieval legislation included detailed regulations about shoe geometry. But here's what makes this particularly fascinating from our modern perspective. These shoes weren't just worn for special occasions. People conducted their daily business in them. They walked to market, tended to livestock, and performed manual labor while wearing what were essentially architectural experiments strapped to their feet. The human capacity for adaptation in the name of fashion appears to be limitless. Moving forward through time, we encounter another peculiar obsession that dominated European fashion for several centuries: the ruff. These elaborate circular collars started as simple neck accessories, but evolved into structures that resembled dinner plates made of starched linen and lace. By the late 16th century, some ruffs extended 18 inches from the neck in all directions. The engineering required to maintain these ruffs was extraordinary. They needed special supports called support as, which were essentially wire frameworks that held the fabric in its rigid circular shape. The laundering process alone was an art form. Special laundresses called clear starchers developed techniques for maintaining the complex pleated structures. The starch was often tinted blue to make the white linen appear even whiter by contrast. Consider the practical implications. Eating became a carefully choreographed exercise. You couldn't simply lean forward to take a bite. Food had to be lifted higher, and special long-handled spoons were developed specifically for rough wearers. Turning your head required moving your entire upper body. Embracing someone was virtually impossible, yet these accessories remained fashionable for over a century. The most elaborate ruffs required hours to properly arrange each morning. Servants specialized in rough construction and maintenance. The cost of a single high-quality ruff could equal several months' wages for a working person, yet they were considered essential for anyone wishing to appear respectable in polite society. What's particularly soothing to contemplate is how seriously people took these fashion requirements. There's something oddly comforting about imagining our ancestors carefully planning their daily activities around their clothing limitations. The slow, deliberate way they must have moved through their world, the patience required to dress and undress, the acceptance of discomfort as the price of social acceptance. As we drift further into the 17th century, we encounter another fascinating example of fashion's ability to reshape human behavior. The farthingale, a structured undergarment that created an enormous bell shape beneath women's skirts. These weren't subtle shape enhancers. At their most extreme, farthingales could extend up to 6 feet in diameter, making the wearer roughly as wide as she was tall. The engineering of these garments was remarkable. They consisted of graduated hoops of whalebone, wood, or steel wire, carefully spaced and connected to create the perfect dome shape. The larger versions required careful planning just to move through doorways. Special wide chairs were designed to accommodate the seated silhouette. Carriages needed to be modified with wider doors and adjusted seating arrangements. The social implications were equally fascinating. Intimate conversation became impossible. You literally couldn't get close enough to another person to whisper. Dancing required completely different choreography, with partners maintaining distances that would seem absurdly formal by today's standards. Yet this isolation was seen as desirable, creating an aura of untouchable refinement around the wearer. The daily logistics must have been extraordinary. Getting dressed required assistance from multiple servants. The structures were so wide that they had to be put on in specially designed rooms with high ceilings and extra space. Once dressed, the wearer had to plan her movements carefully, calculating whether she could fit through specific doorways or navigate particular staircases. But perhaps most remarkably, these garments were worn for extended periods. Women didn't change out of their farthingales for comfort. They conducted their entire social lives while wearing what were essentially portable architectural structures. The commitment to fashion over practicality was absolute. There's something deeply meditative about imagining the rhythm of life constrained by such elaborate clothing. The slow, measured movements required, the way conversations must have unfolded at greater distances, perhaps encouraging more thoughtful speech, the patience needed to navigate simple tasks that we now take for granted. So, moving into the 18th century, we encounter what might be the most architecturally ambitious hairstyle in human history. The poof, or poof, was a women's hairstyle that began modestly but grew to extraordinary proportions. At its peak, these hairstyles could reach heights of 3 feet or more, requiring internal frameworks and sometimes taking an entire day to construct. The process was elaborate and time-consuming. Hair was teased, powdered, and built up over wire frames or padding made from horsehair. Pomades and powders were applied in layers to achieve the proper color and hold. Decorative elements were then added: ribbons, feathers, flowers, and sometimes entire miniature scenes. Some wealthy women had their hair decorated with small ships, gardens, or even bird cages with live birds inside. The maintenance of these hairstyles was a constant concern. Once constructed, a poof might be preserved for weeks or even months. Women slept sitting up or used special pillows designed to protect their elaborate coiffures. The structures attracted vermin, leading to the use of long ivory scratching sticks to relieve itching without disturbing the arrangement. The height of these hairstyles created practical challenges that required creative solutions. Doorways were too low, so women had to duck or remove decorative elements to pass through. Carriages needed modified roofs or required passengers to travel with their heads out of windows. Theater boxes were redesigned to accommodate the vertical fashion requirements. Yet the social pressure to maintain these elaborate styles was enormous. A woman's hair was seen as a reflection of her status, creativity, and commitment to fashion. Professional hairdressers became highly sought-after artists, commanding impressive fees for their architectural hair sculptures. The most fashionable women competed to create the most elaborate and creative designs. The slow pace required for life with such hairstyles must have been remarkable. Every movement had to be calculated to avoid damage to the structure. Bending over was impossible. Quick movements could dislodge carefully placed decorative elements. The entire rhythm of daily life slowed to accommodate these magnificent but impractical creations. There's something wonderfully absurd, yet oddly peaceful, about imagining a world where getting ready for the day was such an elaborate, time-consuming ritual, where fashion required such commitment and patience that it fundamentally changed how people moved through their daily lives. The dedication to beauty and status over convenience speaks to a different relationship with time itself. As we continue our gentle journey through fashion's strangest moments, we find ourselves in the early 19th century, encountering another trend that prioritized appearance over basic human comfort. The empire waistline, while perhaps not as obviously impractical as some of our previous examples, created its own unique set of challenges and adaptations. This style positioned the waistline just below the bust, creating a long, flowing silhouette that was meant to evoke classical Greek and Roman statuary. The look was elegant and ethereal, but it required specific undergarments and careful construction to achieve the proper drape and proportion. Women wore specially designed corsets that pushed the bust up and forward while creating the high waistline. The skirts fell straight down from this elevated waist, creating an almost column-like silhouette. The effect was beautiful, but required careful attention to posture and movement to maintain the intended graceful flow. The fabrics used were often lightweight and flowing, muslins and silks that moved beautifully but provided little warmth or protection. This was fashion that prioritized aesthetic effect over practical concerns like weather or comfort. Women shivered through cold seasons in gossamer gowns because the style demanded it. But what makes this trend particularly interesting is how it influenced behavior and social interaction. The high waistline and flowing skirts created a particular way of moving that was considered graceful and feminine. Women learned to walk and sit in ways that maintained the aesthetic integrity of their clothing. The fashion literally shaped their physical presence in the world. The social implications were equally fascinating. Conversations became more formal, partly because the elevated bust line and flowing skirts created a kind of physical dignity that seemed to demand more refined behavior. Dance steps were modified to accommodate the different proportions. Even simple activities, like picking up dropped objects, required new techniques. What's particularly soothing to consider is how this style created a kind of mindful awareness of movement. Every gesture had to be considered in relation to how it would affect the drape of the fabric, the positioning of the waistline, the overall silhouette. There was a meditative quality to dressing and moving in these garments that forced a slower, more deliberate pace of life. Moving deeper into the 19th century, we encounter one of fashion's most enduring and controversial trends, the bustle. This rear extension of women's skirts created silhouettes that seem almost impossible to modern eyes. The bustle went through several distinct phases, each more architecturally ambitious than the last. The early bustles of the 1870s were relatively modest, creating a gentle backward extension of the skirt. But by the 1880s, the trend had evolved into something truly extraordinary. The bustle became a horizontal shelf, projecting dramatically from the lower back, creating a silhouette that was nearly as wide from side to side as it was from front to back. The engineering required was remarkable. Wire cages, steel springs, and horsehair padding were combined to create structures that could support yards of heavy fabric while maintaining their shape throughout a day of wear. Some bustles were hinged, allowing women to sit by folding the structure upward against their backs. Others were rigid, requiring special chairs and modified furniture. The daily logistics of life with a bustle required constant awareness and planning. Doorways had to be navigated sideways. Sitting required careful positioning to avoid damaging the structure or creating awkward fabric arrangements. Walking up or down stairs became an exercise in spatial geometry, as the extended skirts had to be managed to avoid tripping. Yet women conducted full, active lives while wearing these elaborate contraptions. They attended lengthy social events, traveled in carriages, managed households, and participated in all the complex social rituals of Victorian society. The commitment to maintaining the proper silhouette was absolute, regardless of the practical challenges it created. There's something deeply calming about imagining the patience required for such fashion. The slow, careful movements, the way every action had to be planned and executed with consideration for the extended dimensions of one's clothing. The acceptance that comfort and convenience were secondary to achieving the desired aesthetic effect. The bustle also created interesting social dynamics. Physical intimacy became more formal and distanced. Embracing someone wearing a full bustle required careful choreography. Dancing was transformed into an exercise in managing space and movement around the extended silhouettes. Even simple conversations required positioning that took the clothing into account. As we drift into the late 19th century, we encounter another fascinating example of fashion's ability to reshape human behavior. The tight-lacing corset reached its most extreme form during this period, creating waistlines that seem almost impossibly small to modern eyes. These weren't just fitted garments, they were body-reshaping devices that fundamentally altered the wearer's silhouette and physical capabilities. The process of tight lacing was gradual and required dedication. Young women began wearing training corsets that gradually reduced their waist measurements over months or years. The goal was to achieve the ideal hourglass figure, with waist measurements that were often 12 to 16 inches smaller than the natural waistline. The corsets themselves were marvels of engineering. They contained dozens of steel bones, carefully positioned to distribute pressure and maintain the desired shape. The lacing required assistance, as it was impossible to achieve the necessary tightness without help. The process could take 30 minutes or more, and once laced, the corset couldn't be removed without assistance. The physical effects were dramatic. Breathing became shallow and deliberate. Sudden movements were impossible. Bending at the waist was eliminated entirely, requiring new ways of moving and positioning the body. Eating large meals became uncomfortable or impossible, leading to changes in dining habits and social customs around food. Yet these restrictions were embraced as necessary for achieving the ideal feminine silhouette. Women planned their days around the limitations imposed by their corsets. They developed new ways of moving, sitting, and interacting with their environment. The discomfort was accepted as the price of beauty and social acceptability. The social rituals around tight lacing were elaborate and time-consuming. The morning ritual of being laced into the corset was a private ceremony, often involving mothers, sisters, or ladies' maids. The evening unlacing was equally ritualized, a moment of physical relief that marked the transition from public to private life. There's something oddly peaceful about contemplating this daily rhythm of restriction and release. The way women adapted to their constrained circumstances, finding grace and dignity within the limitations imposed by their clothing. The patience required for such elaborate dressing rituals speaks to a different relationship with time and preparation. The tight-laced silhouette also influenced furniture design, fashion, and social spaces. Chairs were designed with the corseted figure in mind. Clothing was cut to enhance the artificial waistline. Even architecture began to reflect the aesthetic preferences created by these dramatically altered silhouettes. As we move into the early 20th century, we find fashion beginning to shift toward greater practicality, but not without one last hurrah of impractical elegance. The hobble skirt emerged in the 1910s as a reaction against the full skirts of previous decades, but it created its own unique set of challenges. These skirts were so narrow at the hem that they severely restricted walking. The name hobble was quite literal, as wearers were forced to take tiny mincing steps to avoid tearing the fabric or losing their balance. Some versions were so restrictive that they included a cord or chain between the ankles to prevent overstriding. The hobble skirt represented a fascinating moment in fashion history where the pendulum swung from one extreme to another. After decades of enormous skirts supported by elaborate understructures, fashion suddenly demanded skirts so narrow they barely allowed for basic locomotion. The social implications were immediate and dramatic. Women's participation in public life became more limited. Sports and physical activities were virtually impossible. Even simple tasks like climbing stairs or entering carriages required careful planning and often assistance. Yet the style was embraced enthusiastically by fashionable women who saw it as the height of modern elegance. The restriction was part of the appeal, creating a kind of refined helplessness that was considered attractive and feminine. The inability to move quickly or freely was seen as a mark of refinement and status. The daily rhythm of life in a hobble skirt must have been remarkably slow and deliberate. Every step required consideration. Every movement had to be planned and executed with care. There was a meditative quality to this enforced mindfulness, a way of being in the world that prioritized grace over efficiency. As we continue our gentle exploration of fashion's oddest moments, these trends remind us that every generation has its own relationship with beauty, status, and self-expression. The commitment our ancestors showed to maintaining these elaborate and often uncomfortable styles speaks to something fundamental about human nature, our willingness to sacrifice comfort for appearance, practicality for social acceptance. There's something deeply soothing about examining these historical fashion choices without judgment, understanding them as products of their time and culture. Each trend, no matter how impractical it might seem to us now, represented real people making real choices about how they wanted to present themselves to the world. The early 20th century brought us another delightfully impractical trend that seems almost engineered to make daily life more complicated. The Merry Widow hat, named after a popular operetta of the time, reached proportions that defied both logic and physics. These weren't just large hats, they were portable shade structures, some measuring up to 3 feet in diameter, decorated with enough feathers, flowers, and fabric to stock a small millinery shop. Picture trying to navigate your morning routine while balancing what amounts to a small table on your head. The engineering required to keep these enormous constructions in place was remarkable. Hat pins, some measuring up to a foot long, were driven through the hat and into the hair with enough force to anchor the entire structure. Women literally wore weapons in their hair in the name of fashion. The social implications were immediate and far-reaching. Public transportation had to be redesigned. Theater seats were spaced differently. Even the simple act of passing someone on a sidewalk became a complex negotiation of space and timing. 2 women wearing full-sized Merry Widow hats couldn't walk side by side without careful coordination. The wind presented constant challenges. A strong gust could turn a fashionable accessory into a dangerous projectile. Women developed specific walking techniques to maintain balance and protect their elaborate headwear. The slow, measured pace required to keep these creations stable created an entirely new rhythm of movement through public spaces. What's particularly fascinating is how seriously society took these challenges. Special hat boxes were manufactured that could accommodate the enormous dimensions. Restaurants redesigned their seating arrangements. Even architecture began to account for the vertical space requirements of fashionable women. The morning ritual of putting on such a hat required assistance and considerable time. The positioning had to be perfect, the pins strategically placed, the decorative elements arranged just so. It was a construction project that happened fresh each day, a commitment to beauty that demanded patience and precision. Moving deeper into the century, we encounter the curious case of the lampshade tunic, a fashion trend that emerged in the 1920s as designers experimented with increasingly geometric and architectural approaches to clothing. These garments literally resembled lampshades, with stiff, cylindrical silhouettes that stood away from the body in perfect circles. The construction was remarkable for its complete disregard of human anatomy. These tunics maintained their shape regardless of the wearer's movements, creating a kind of portable architecture that moved through space like a walking sculpture. The fabric was heavily starched or supported by internal structures that kept the garment in its intended geometric form. The practical challenges were immediate and obvious. Sitting became virtually impossible without careful arrangement of the stiff fabric. Bending over was out of the question. Even simple gestures, like reaching for objects, required planning to avoid disturbing the perfect cylindrical silhouette. Yet women embraced these garments as the height of modern sophistication. The restriction was part of the appeal in creating a kind of living art piece that moved through the world with geometric precision. The wearer became a walking demonstration of design principles, human form subordinated to artistic vision. The social dynamics created by these garments were equally fascinating. Physical interaction became more formal and distant. The rigid structures prevented casual contact, creating an aura of untouchable modernity around the wearer. Conversations happened across the diameter of the garment, adding physical distance to social interaction. There's something wonderfully absurd, yet oddly calming about imagining daily life conducted within these geometric constraints. The slow, careful movements required to maintain the proper silhouette, the way every action had to be planned around the architectural requirements of one's clothing. The acceptance that the human form was secondary to the artistic statement being made. As we drift into the 1930s, fashion took another peculiar turn with the introduction of the bias-cut evening gown that was so form-fitting it essentially eliminated the possibility of wearing undergarments. These dresses were cut on the diagonal of the fabric, creating a liquid-like drape that clung to every curve and revealed the natural silhouette in startling detail. The engineering required to achieve this effect was extraordinary. Each dress had to be cut and sewn with mathematical precision to create the proper drape. The slightest miscalculation in the bias angle could result in a garment that twisted or pulled incorrectly. The construction was so complex that only the most skilled seamstresses could execute it properly. The social implications were dramatic. These dresses revealed more of the female form than had been fashionable for decades, yet they did so through sophisticated tailoring rather than obvious exposure. The effect was both modest and provocative, creating a new standard for elegant sensuality. The practical challenges were considerable. The close fit meant that even slight weight fluctuations could affect the drape dramatically. Eating became a strategic exercise, as any fullness could disturb the intended silhouette. Movement had to be graceful and controlled to maintain the liquid-like flow of the fabric. The daily routine of wearing such garments required a kind of mindful awareness of body and movement that was almost meditative. Every gesture had to be considered in relation to how it would affect the drape of the dress. Sitting, standing, walking, all required a consciousness of form and line that influenced behavior in subtle but profound ways. What's particularly soothing to contemplate is how these garments encouraged a slower, more deliberate way of moving through the world. The attention required to maintain the proper silhouette created a kind of enforced mindfulness, a way of being present in one's physical form that we rarely experience in our modern, comfort-focused fashion choices. The 1940s brought us another curious trend that seemed designed to test the limits of human adaptability. The platform shoe reached heights that turned walking into a balancing act, requiring genuine skill and courage. These weren't modest elevations. Some platforms reached 8 inches or more, essentially putting the wearer on stilts disguised as footwear. The construction was remarkable for its ambition and engineering challenges. Cork, wood, and later synthetic materials were carved and shaped into towering foundations that had to support the entire weight of the wearer while maintaining stability during movement. The shoes became architectural structures in their own right. The daily logistics of life in such footwears required complete reorganization of movement patterns. Stairs became mountaineering exercises, uneven surfaces turned into obstacle courses. The simple act of walking demanded constant attention and balance, transforming every journey into a deliberate, mindful experience. Yet women embraced these challenges with remarkable determination. The height was seen as glamorous and fashionable, worth the considerable effort required to master the necessary walking techniques. Dance floors became showcases for the skill required to move gracefully while essentially walking on stilts. The social dynamics were equally fascinating. Height became a fashion statement, literally elevating the wearer above her surroundings. Conversations happened at different levels, creating new dynamics in social interaction. The effort required to walk in such shoes became a demonstration of dedication to fashion and beauty. There's something oddly peaceful about imagining the slow, careful pace required for life in platform shoes. Every step had to be planned and executed with precision. The enforced mindfulness of movement created a different rhythm of daily life, one where getting from place to place became a deliberate, conscious act rather than an automatic function. As we move into the 1950s, we encounter another trend that prioritized appearance over practicality in truly remarkable ways. The circle skirt, when worn with the proper petticoats, could extend to diameters of 8 feet or more, creating silhouettes that required careful navigation through doorways and constant awareness of spatial relationships. These skirts weren't just full, they were architectural achievements. Multiple layers of stiffened petticoats created the proper shape, with some requiring up to 7 separate underskirts to achieve the desired volume. The engineering was complex, involving graduated layers of increasing stiffness to create the perfect bell shape. The daily challenges were considerable. Car doors had to be approached strategically, Restaurant booths became impossible. Even simple activities, like picking up dropped objects, required new techniques, as bending over in the traditional manner was out of the question with so much fabric to manage. The morning ritual of getting dressed was elaborate and time consuming. Each petticoat had to be positioned correctly, the layers arranged to create the proper silhouette. The process could take an hour or more, and once dressed, the wearer had to plan her day around the spatial requirements of her clothing. Yet these challenges were embraced enthusiastically by women who saw the full skirt as the height of feminine elegance. The volume was part of the appeal, creating a kind of portable privacy that surrounded the wearer with fabric and formality. The restriction was transformed into a statement of refined femininity. The social implications were equally interesting. Physical interaction became more formal and distant. Dancing required new choreography to accommodate the extended silhouettes. Even simple conversations required positioning that took the volume of clothing into account. Moving into the 1960s, fashion took a dramatically different turn with the introduction of geometric mini dresses that seemed to prioritize architectural form over human comfort. These weren't just short dresses, they were sculptural statements that maintained their shape regardless of the wearer's movements. The construction was remarkable for its complete independence from human anatomy. Heavy fabrics, internal structures, and geometric cuts created garments that stood away from the body in perfect geometric forms. The wearer became a kind of walking sculpture, human form subordinated to design principles. The practical challenges were immediate. Sitting required careful arrangement of the stiff fabric. Movement had to be controlled to maintain the intended geometric silhouette. Even simple gestures, like reaching or bending, could disturb the perfect architectural lines. Yet these garments were embraced as the height of modern sophistication. The geometric precision was seen as futuristic and avant-garde, worth the considerable discomfort required to wear them properly. The restriction became part of the artistic statement. The daily rhythm of life in such garments required a kind of choreographed awareness. Every movement had to be planned around the architectural requirements of the clothing. The enforced mindfulness created a different way of moving through the world, one where form took precedence over function. As we continue our gentle journey through fashion's most impractical moments, we find ourselves contemplating the curious relationship between beauty and discomfort that has persisted throughout human history. Each of these trends, no matter how bizarre they might seem to modern eyes, represented real people making real choices about how they wanted to present themselves to the world. The commitment required to maintain these elaborate fashion statements speaks to something fundamental about human nature. Our willingness to sacrifice comfort for appearance, to reorganize our daily lives around aesthetic principles, to find grace and dignity within the most restrictive circumstances. There's something deeply soothing about examining these historical choices without judgment, understanding them as products of their particular time and culture. Each trend created its own rhythm of daily life, its own requirements for patience and adaptation, its own opportunities for mindful awareness of movement and form. The slow pace required by these elaborate fashions created a different relationship with time itself. Getting dressed became a ritual, moving became a conscious act, and daily life took on a meditative quality that we rarely experience in our modern, comfort-focused world. As we prepare to explore even more curious fashion choices from decades past, we can appreciate how each generation has found its own ways to transform the simple act of getting dressed into an elaborate statement of identity, status, and aesthetic vision. The human capacity for adaptation in the name of beauty appears to be truly limitless. The 1970s ushered in what might be considered one of fashion's most physically demanding trends, the platform boot that reached heights that transformed walking into an extreme sport. These weren't modest elevations designed for comfort or practicality. We're talking about footwear that added 12, 15, sometimes even 18 inches to the wearer's natural height, essentially turning every step into a carefully calculated balancing act. The construction of these towering boots was an engineering marvel that defied both gravity and common sense. Cork, wood, and dense foam were layered and carved into massive foundations that had to support the entire weight of a human body while maintaining some semblance of stability. The platforms were often wider than the actual foot, creating a kind of snowshoe effect that made navigation through crowded spaces a complex exercise in spatial awareness. Consider the daily logistics of life in such footwear. Stairs became mountaineering expeditions, requiring careful planning and often the assistance of handrails or helpful companions. Curbs turned into cliff faces that demanded strategic approach and execution. The simple act of getting into a car required a complete rethinking of movement patterns, often involving sitting first and then carefully maneuvering the enormous platforms into position. Yet the social pressure to wear these architectural marvels was immense. Height was equated with glamour, and the ability to walk gracefully in such extreme footwear became a mark of sophisticated fashion consciousness. Dance floors became showcases for the remarkable skill required to move rhythmically while essentially performing on stilts. The morning ritual of putting on platform boots was itself a ceremony requiring patience and strategy. The lacing or buckling process could take 15 minutes or more, and once secured, the wearer had to mentally prepare for a day of hyper-awareness about every surface, every step, every potential obstacle that might challenge their elevated equilibrium. There's something oddly meditative about imagining the enforced mindfulness required by such footwear. Every movement had to be deliberate and considered. The pace of life naturally slowed to accommodate the careful navigation required. Walking became less of an automatic function and more of a conscious, almost ceremonial act. The 1980s brought us another fascinating example of fashion's ability to reshape human behavior through the introduction of power shoulder garments that seemed designed to transform the wearer into a living geometric sculpture. These weren't subtle shoulder enhancements. We're talking about shoulder pads that extended 12, 18, sometimes 24 inches beyond the natural shoulder line, creating silhouettes that appeared to defy anatomical possibility. The engineering required to maintain these dramatic proportions was remarkable. Foam padding, wire structures, and carefully constructed internal frameworks were sewn into jackets, dresses, and even casual wear to create the desired architectural effect. The shoulder pads had to be positioned precisely to create symmetrical lines while remaining stable during movement. The practical challenges were immediate and far-reaching. Doorways required sideways navigation. Car seats had to be adjusted to accommodate the extended shoulder lines. Even simple activities, like reaching for objects, became exercises in spatial calculation, as the artificial shoulders could easily knock over items or bump into unsuspecting passers-by. The social dynamics created by these exaggerated silhouettes were equally fascinating. Personal space requirements expanded dramatically. Embracing someone became a complex negotiation of angles and positioning. Business meetings took on an almost militaristic quality as participants navigated around each other's extended shoulder architecture. Yet these challenges were embraced as necessary elements of projecting power and authority. The broader shoulders were seen as symbols of strength and capability, visual statements that commanded respect and attention. The discomfort and inconvenience were accepted as reasonable prices to pay for the psychological impact of the enlarged silhouette. The daily ritual of dressing in power shoulder garments required assistance and considerable time. The shoulder pads had to be positioned correctly, the garments adjusted to create the proper proportions. Once dressed, the wearer had to remain conscious of their expanded dimensions throughout the day, constantly aware of the spatial requirements of their artificially enhanced form. Moving into the late 1980s and early 1990s, we encounter another trend that seemed specifically designed to test the limits of human adaptability. The parachute pant, despite its name suggesting freedom and movement, actually created its own unique set of restrictions and challenges that transformed the simple act of walking into a carefully choreographed performance. These garments were constructed from synthetic materials that created a distinctive swishing sound with every movement. The fabric was designed to billow and flow, creating dramatic silhouettes that bore little resemblance to the natural lines of the human leg. The effect was striking, but came with considerable practical complications. The volume of fabric in these pants was extraordinary. Some versions contained enough material to create actual parachutes, and the way they moved through air created unique aerodynamic challenges. Wind became a significant factor in daily planning, as even a modest breeze could turn the wearer into an inadvertent sail, creating balance and navigation issues. The daily logistics of wearing parachute pants required constant awareness of the fabric's behavior. Sitting down became a complex exercise in fabric management, requiring careful arrangement to avoid creating awkward bunching or unflattering silhouettes. Walking through crowds demanded heightened spatial awareness to prevent the billowing fabric from catching on objects or other people. The morning routine of putting on these garments was surprisingly complex. The pants had to be adjusted carefully to create the proper drape and flow. The positioning of the waistband, the arrangement of the leg openings, the overall distribution of fabric all required attention and often assistance to achieve the desired effect. Yet the appeal of these garments was undeniable. They represented a kind of freedom from traditional clothing constraints, a celebration of movement and fluidity that seemed to embody the spirit of their era. The challenges they presented were seen as small prices to pay for the dramatic visual impact they created. The 1990s introduced us to another curious trend that prioritized aesthetic impact over practical considerations. The extremely low-rise jeans that emerged during this period created silhouettes that seemed to defy both gravity and modesty, requiring constant vigilance and frequent readjustment to maintain appropriate coverage. These weren't just low-waisted pants. The waistline sat so far below the natural waist that it challenged basic assumptions about how clothing should relate to human anatomy. The rise was often so minimal that sitting, bending, or even walking briskly could create immediate wardrobe malfunctions. The engineering challenges were considerable. Designers had to find ways to keep the garments in place without traditional waistline support. New construction techniques were developed, involving specialized fits and strategic placement of seams and closures to maintain the extremely low positioning. The daily management of such garments required constant awareness and frequent adjustment. Simple activities like climbing stairs or getting into cars became exercises in modesty management. The wearer had to develop new movement patterns and positioning strategies to maintain appropriate coverage throughout the day. The social implications were equally complex. The extremely low waistline created new standards for what was considered acceptable public attire. Dress codes had to be rewritten to address the challenges posed by garments that revealed areas traditionally considered private. Yet the trend was embraced enthusiastically by young people who saw the low-rise silhouette as modern and rebellious. The constant vigilance required to wear such garments appropriately became part of their appeal, creating a kind of fashion challenge that demonstrated commitment to contemporary style. The morning ritual of putting on extremely low-rise jeans required careful consideration of undergarments, positioning, and daily activities. The wearer had to plan their day around the limitations and requirements of their clothing choice, accepting that comfort and ease of movement would be secondary to achieving the desired aesthetic effect. As we moved into the early 2000s, fashion took another interesting turn with the introduction of the extremely pointed toe shoe that seemed designed to challenge basic assumptions about foot anatomy and comfortable locomotion. These weren't modest toe enhancements. The points extended sometimes 6 or 8 inches beyond the actual toe, creating footwear that resembled medieval court shoes crossed with architectural experiments. The construction of these shoes required remarkable engineering to maintain structural integrity while creating the dramatic pointed silhouette. Internal supports, specialized lasting techniques, and carefully designed toe boxes were necessary to prevent collapse while providing some minimal level of wearability. The practical challenges were immediate and obvious. Walking required careful attention to avoid catching the extended toes on uneven surfaces, stairs, or other obstacles. The points acted like tiny battering rams, making navigation through crowded spaces a delicate exercise in precision and awareness. The daily logistics of wearing such footwear transformed simple activities into complex undertakings. Getting dressed required extra time to lace or secure the elongated shoes. Walking distances had to be calculated differently, accounting for the reduced efficiency and increased effort required by the impractical toe extensions. Yet the dramatic visual impact of these shoes made them highly desirable among fashion-conscious individuals. The extreme points were seen as bold statements of style commitment, worth the considerable inconvenience they created. The challenges became part of the fashion statement itself. The social dynamics created by pointed-toe shoes were fascinating to observe. The wearer moved through spaces differently, with greater care and attention to foot placement. Conversations often included comments about the dramatic footwear, making the shoes themselves conversation pieces that commanded attention and admiration. As we continue our gentle journey through fashion's more impractical moments, we encounter the early 2000s trend of layering multiple garments in combinations that seem designed to test the limits of human heat tolerance and movement flexibility. This wasn't simply wearing a sweater over a shirt. We're talking about elaborate layering systems that could involve 6, 8, or even 10 separate pieces of clothing worn simultaneously. The construction of these layered looks required careful planning and considerable skill. Each layer had to be chosen, not just for its individual aesthetic merit, but for how it would interact with all the other layers. Colors, textures, lengths, and fits all had to be coordinated to create a cohesive whole that somehow made sense despite its obvious complexity. The practical challenges were considerable. Getting dressed became a major undertaking that could require an hour or more of careful layer arrangement. The bulk created by multiple garments made movement awkward and sitting uncomfortable. Temperature regulation became nearly impossible, as the wearer was essentially trapped in a textile system designed more for visual impact than for comfort. The daily management of layered looks required constant attention. Layers would shift and bunch during normal activities, requiring frequent readjustment throughout the day. The weight of multiple garments created fatigue and discomfort that had to be endured in the name of fashion. Yet the layered aesthetic was seen as sophisticated and artistically complex. The ability to successfully combine multiple pieces into a cohesive look was considered a mark of fashion expertise. The challenges were embraced as necessary elements of achieving the desired sophisticated appearance. The social implications were equally interesting. The layered looks created visual complexity that commanded attention and admiration. Conversations often focused on the skill required to assemble such elaborate outfits, making the clothing itself a topic of social interaction and artistic appreciation. Moving into the mid-2000s, we encounter another trend that seemed specifically designed to challenge conventional ideas about appropriate footwear. The Ugg boot phenomenon represented a fascinating moment when comfort footwear was transformed into a fashion statement that created its own unique set of social and practical complications. These weren't just comfortable boots, they were shapeless, oversized sheepskin constructions that bore little resemblance to traditional footwear aesthetics. The appeal seemed to lie precisely in their rejection of conventional shoe design principles, creating a kind of anti-fashion statement that somehow became fashionable. The practical challenges were subtle but significant. The boots provided little support or structure, making extended walking uncomfortable despite their reputation for comfort. The sheepskin construction absorbed moisture and odors, requiring special care and maintenance. The loose fit made them unsuitable for many activities, despite their casual appearance. The social dynamics created by Ugg boots were particularly fascinating. They became symbols of a certain lifestyle and attitude, markers of casual affluence and rejection of formal fashion conventions. The ability to wear such obviously impractical footwear became a statement about one's freedom from conventional dress requirements. The daily routine of wearing Ugg boots required acceptance of their limitations and careful planning around their practical shortcomings. Activities had to be chosen with consideration for the boot's lack of support and weather resistance. The wearer had to embrace a more limited range of movement and activity in exchange for the social signaling provided by the distinctive footwear. Yet the boots were embraced enthusiastically by people who saw them as comfortable alternatives to more structured footwear. The challenges they presented were minimized in favor of their symbolic value and their association with relaxed, casual lifestyles. As we drift deeper into the 2000s, we find ourselves contemplating another curious fashion moment that seemed to prioritize visual drama over practical wearability. The extremely distressed denim trend took the concept of worn clothing to artistic extremes, creating garments that appeared to be held together by little more than hope and strategic stitching. These weren't simply jeans with a few artful tears. We're talking about denim so thoroughly distressed that it challenged basic assumptions about clothing integrity. Strategic holes, frayed edges, and deliberate damage were engineered into the fabric to create looks that appeared accidentally destroyed while actually being carefully constructed. The engineering required to create stable distressed denim was remarkable. Designers had to calculate exactly how much fabric could be removed while maintaining structural integrity. Hidden reinforcements, strategic backing materials, and carefully placed seams were necessary to prevent complete garment failure. The practical challenges were considerable. The holes and tears made the garments vulnerable to further damage during normal wear. Sitting, bending, or even walking briskly could expand the existing distressing beyond acceptable limits. The wearer had to develop new movement patterns to protect the deliberately weakened fabric. The daily management of heavily distressed denim required constant vigilance. The wearer had to monitor the condition of the tears and holes throughout the day, checking for expansion or new damage that might compromise modesty or garment integrity. Activities had to be chosen with consideration for the fragile nature of the deliberately damaged clothing. Yet the aesthetic appeal of distressed denim was undeniable. The carefully crafted appearance of accidental damage was seen as authentic and rebellious, worth the considerable maintenance and care required to preserve the deliberately distressed appearance. The social implications were equally complex. The expensive, carefully crafted appearance of poverty and wear created interesting commentary on authenticity and fashion. The ability to afford clothing designed to look damaged became a peculiar marker of fashion consciousness and economic status. As we continue our exploration of fashion's more puzzling moments, we find ourselves in the late 2000s encountering another trend that seemed designed to test the limits of both balance and dignity. The extremely high stiletto heel reached heights that transformed walking into a performance art requiring genuine skill and considerable courage. Those weren't just high heels. We're talking about footwear with heel heights of 6, 7, or even 8 inches, creating dramatic elevation that fundamentally altered the wearer's center of gravity and movement patterns. The engineering required to create stable footwear at such heights was remarkable and often unsuccessful. The construction challenges were enormous. The heel had to be strong enough to support the entire weight of the wearer while remaining thin enough to maintain the desired aesthetic effect. The angle of the foot was so extreme that specialized padding and support systems were necessary to prevent injury. The practical implications were immediate and far-reaching. Walking became a careful balancing act, requiring constant attention and concentration. Stairs turned into major obstacles, requiring handrails and careful foot placement. Even standing still required active balance and muscle engagement. The daily logistics of wearing extreme heels transformed simple activities into complex undertakings. Getting dressed required extra time to secure the elaborate footwear. Walking distances had to be calculated differently, accounting for the reduced efficiency and increased effort required by the impractical elevation. Yet the dramatic visual impact of extreme heels made them highly sought after among fashion-conscious individuals. The height was seen as glamorous and sophisticated, worth the considerable discomfort and risk involved in wearing such impractical footwear. The social dynamics created by extreme heels were fascinating to observe. The wearer commanded attention through their elevated presence and the obvious skill required to move gracefully in such challenging footwear. The heels became conversation pieces that demonstrated commitment to fashion and beauty. As we move into the 2010s, we encounter another curious trend that seemed to prioritize visual impact over practical wearability. The skinny jean phenomenon reached extremes of tightness that challenged basic assumptions about clothing fit and human circulation, creating garments that appeared to be painted onto the wearer's legs. These weren't just fitted jeans. We're talking about denim so tight that getting dressed required strategic planning and sometimes assistance. The fabric had to stretch beyond normal parameters while maintaining its shape and appearance throughout extended wear. The engineering challenges were considerable. Designers had to develop new fabric blends and construction techniques to create jeans that could achieve such extreme fits while remaining wearable. The balance between stretch and recovery, between fit and durability, required constant innovation and refinement. The practical challenges were immediate and obvious. Sitting became uncomfortable after extended periods. Bending, squatting, or climbing stairs required careful movement to avoid fabric stress or circulation restriction. The tight fit made simple activities, like retrieving items from pockets, complex exercises in fabric manipulation. The daily management of extremely tight jeans required acceptance of their limitations and careful planning around their practical shortcomings. Activities had to be chosen with consideration for the restrictions imposed by the unforgiving fit. The wearer had to embrace a more limited range of movement in exchange for achieving the desired silhouette. Yet the skinny jean aesthetic was embraced enthusiastically by fashion-conscious individuals who saw the tight fit as modern and flattering. The challenges they presented were minimized in favor of their ability to create dramatic, form-fitting silhouettes that commanded attention and admiration. The social implications were equally interesting. The extremely tight jeans became symbols of youth and fashion consciousness, markers of commitment to contemporary style trends. The ability to wear such restrictive clothing became a statement about one's dedication to achieving fashionable appearance regardless of comfort considerations. As we prepare to explore even more recent fashion curiosities, we can appreciate how each of these trends created its own rhythm of daily life, its own requirements for patience and adaptation. The human capacity for finding grace and dignity within the most restrictive fashion circumstances continues to amaze and inspire contemplation about our relationship with beauty, status, and self-expression. The commitment shown by generations of fashion followers To maintain these elaborate and often uncomfortable styles speaks to something fundamental about human nature. Our willingness to reorganize our daily lives around aesthetic principles, to find meaning and identity through our clothing choices, to accept discomfort as the price of beauty and social acceptance. There's something deeply soothing about examining these fashion choices as products of their particular times and cultures, understanding them as expressions of the human desire to transform the simple act of getting dressed into an elaborate statement of identity and artistic vision. The 2010s also introduced us to a fashion phenomenon that seemed to challenge basic principles of garment construction and human mobility. The drop crotch pant reached proportions that transformed the simple act of walking into an exercise in fabric management and spatial awareness. These weren't just loose-fitting trousers. We're talking about garments where the crotch seam hung so low it could reach mid-thigh or even knee level, creating silhouettes that appeared to defy both gravity and conventional tailoring wisdom. The engineering required to make such garments functional was remarkable. Designers had to calculate exactly how much fabric could be added to the crotch area while maintaining some semblance of wearability. The excess material had to be distributed in ways that wouldn't create complete mobility breakdown, yet the very nature of the design made normal movement patterns nearly impossible. Consider the daily challenges presented by such extreme proportions. Climbing stairs required lifting the knees significantly higher to accommodate the excess fabric. Walking at any pace faster than a leisurely stroll caused the loose crotch area to swing and shift unpredictably. Sitting down became an exercise in fabric arrangement, as the wearer had to gather and position the excess material to avoid awkward bunching. The practical implications extended far beyond simple movement. Getting dressed took considerably longer, as the garments had to be positioned carefully to achieve the intended silhouette. The excess fabric created bulk that made fitting into cars, theater seats, or restaurant booths more complicated. Even simple activities, like picking up dropped objects, required new techniques to work around the fabric constraints. Yet the appeal of drop crotch pants was undeniable among fashion-forward individuals who saw them as avant-garde statements of design innovation. The extreme proportions were embraced as artistic expressions that challenged conventional ideas about how clothing should relate to the human form. The obvious impracticality became part of the aesthetic appeal. The social dynamics created by these garments were equally fascinating. The dramatic silhouettes commanded attention and often sparked conversations about fashion, art, and the boundaries between clothing and sculpture. Wearers moved through spaces differently, with a more deliberate, considered pace that seemed almost ceremonial in its measured precision. There's something oddly meditative about imagining daily life conducted within such fabric constraints. Every movement required conscious consideration of the garment's behavior. The enforced mindfulness created a different relationship with physical space and movement, transforming simple activities into deliberate, almost ritualistic acts. Moving into the mid-2010s, we encounter another trend that seemed specifically designed to test the limits of human adaptability and social convention. The extremely oversized outerwear phenomenon created garments so voluminous they appeared to swallow their wearers entirely, transforming the human silhouette into something resembling a walking sleeping bag or architectural installation. These weren't just large coats. We're talking about outerwear with proportions so extreme they challenged basic assumptions about how clothing should fit and function. Sleeves extended far beyond fingertips, creating fabric tubes that made using hands nearly impossible without careful sleeve management. Shoulder lines drooped to elbow level, creating silhouettes that bore little resemblance to human anatomy. The construction of such garments required innovative approaches to traditional tailoring. Designers had to ensure that despite the enormous proportions, the coats would remain wearable and wouldn't simply slide off the wearer's shoulders. Internal structures, strategic weights, and carefully placed closures were necessary to maintain some relationship between garment and human form. The daily logistics of wearing such oversized outerwear transformed routine activities into complex undertakings. Driving became nearly impossible without significant sleeve adjustment. Eating required careful manipulation of the enormous sleeves to avoid dragging them through food. Even simple gestures, like shaking hands or reaching for objects, demanded strategic fabric management. The weight of these garments was considerable, often equivalent to carrying a heavy blanket throughout the day. The bulk made movement through crowded spaces challenging, as the wearer occupied significantly more room than their actual body would require. Doorways sometimes needed to be navigated sideways to accommodate the expanded silhouette. Yet the oversized aesthetic was embraced enthusiastically by fashion enthusiasts who saw the extreme proportions as statements of comfort-focused luxury and rejection of traditional tailoring constraints. The cocoon-like quality of the garments was seen as protective and nurturing, creating a portable private space that traveled with the wearer. The social implications were particularly interesting. The oversized garments created physical barriers that affected interpersonal interaction. Embracing someone became a complex negotiation of fabric layers and volumes. The wearers seemed to float through spaces wrapped in their textile architecture, creating an aura of mysterious elegance that commanded attention and curiosity. As we drift into the late 2010s, fashion took another curious turn with the introduction of garments that seemed to prioritize photographic impact over real-world wearability. The Instagram-ready dress phenomenon created clothing designed specifically for social media documentation, often featuring elements that looked striking in photographs but created significant practical challenges for actual wear. These garments were engineered for visual impact in specific lighting conditions and camera angles. Dramatic cutouts, impossible structural elements, and gravity-defying constructions were designed to create stunning images rather than comfortable wear. The clothing became props for digital performance rather than functional garments for daily life. The practical challenges were immediate and obvious. Many of these pieces required assistance to put on and could only be worn for brief periods due to their unstable construction. The dramatic elements that photographed beautifully often made basic activities, like sitting, walking, or even standing for extended periods, uncomfortable or impossible. The daily routine of wearing such garments was entirely organized around their photographic documentation. The wearer had to plan carefully for the brief periods when the clothing would be worn, often changing into more practical garments immediately after the photo session. The entire experience of wearing the clothing was subordinated to its visual documentation. Yet the appeal of these photographically optimized garments was enormous among social media influencers and fashion enthusiasts. The ability to create stunning visual content was seen as worth the considerable inconvenience and limited wearability. The garments became tools for digital storytelling rather than traditional clothing. The social dynamics were equally fascinating. The clothing existed primarily in digital spaces, experienced by audiences through screens rather than physical presence. The wearer became a kind of performance artist, transforming their body into a platform for visual experimentation and digital communication. Moving into the 2020s, we encounter what might be the most psychologically complex fashion trend in recent memory. The deliberate mismatching phenomenon encouraged wearers to combine garments in ways that violated traditional principles of coordination and harmony, creating looks that appeared accidentally assembled while actually requiring considerable planning and artistic vision. This wasn't simply wearing unmatched socks. We're talking about systematic violations of color theory, pattern mixing, and style coordination that challenged viewers' aesthetic expectations and created visual tension through deliberate discord. The effect was simultaneously jarring and intriguing, requiring viewers to reconsider their assumptions about what constituted attractive clothing combinations. The mental effort required to successfully execute deliberate mismatching was considerable. Wearers had to develop new aesthetic frameworks that embraced clash and discord as positive elements. The traditional rules of fashion coordination had to be consciously violated in ways that appeared effortless while actually requiring sophisticated understanding of visual principles. The daily process of getting dressed became an exercise in creative rebellion. Each garment choice had to be evaluated not for how well it worked with other pieces, but for how interestingly it clashed with them. The goal was to create visual friction that somehow resolved into a cohesive, artistic statement. The social implications were particularly complex. The deliberately mismatched looks challenged viewers' comfort zones and forced reconsideration of aesthetic assumptions. Conversations often focused on the courage required to wear such unconventional combinations and the artistic vision necessary to make them work. Yet the mismatching trend was embraced by fashion-forward individuals who saw it as liberation from traditional coordination constraints. The freedom to combine any elements, regardless of conventional compatibility, was seen as democratizing and creatively empowering, allowing for personal expression unconstrained by established rules. The psychological impact was equally interesting. Wearing deliberately mismatched clothing required confidence and comfort with standing out in unconventional ways. The trend attracted individuals who were comfortable challenging social norms and aesthetic conventions through their personal presentation. As we continue our gentle exploration through fashion's more puzzling moments, we find ourselves contemplating another recent phenomenon that seemed to prioritize symbolic meaning over practical function. The tiny bag trend created accessories so small they could barely accommodate essential items, transforming the fundamental purpose of handbags from utility to pure aesthetic statement. These weren't just small purses. We're talking about bags the size of coins or small jewelry, accessories that could hold perhaps a single key or credit card, but certainly nothing approaching the contents of a traditional handbag. The engineering required to create functional hardware at such miniature scales was remarkable and often purely decorative. The practical challenges were immediate and obvious. Carrying essential daily items required alternative solutions, often involving additional, more functional bags that contradicted the minimalist aesthetic of the tiny accessory. The wearer had to choose between fashion statement and practical utility, often carrying the tiny bag purely for its visual impact. The daily logistics of using such miniature accessories required complete reorganization of personal item management. Keys, phones, wallets, and other necessities had to be carried in pockets, alternative bags, or by companions. The tiny bag became a symbolic rather than functional element of the outfit. Yet the appeal of these miniature accessories was enormous among fashion enthusiasts who saw them as bold statements of minimalism and aesthetic purity. The obvious impracticality was embraced as part of the artistic statement, demonstrating the wearer's commitment to visual impact over conventional utility. The social dynamics were equally fascinating. The tiny bags became conversation pieces that commanded attention and commentary. Their obvious dysfunction became a kind of fashion joke that wearers shared with observers, creating social interaction around the absurdity of the accessory choice. The psychological implications were particularly interesting. Carrying a bag too small to hold anything useful required acceptance of inconvenience in service of aesthetic statement. The trend attracted individuals comfortable with prioritizing visual impact over practical considerations. As we drift toward the present moment, we encounter fashion trends that seem to blend historical references with contemporary sensibilities in ways that create new forms of practical challenges. The corset as outerwear phenomenon brought internal structural garments into external visibility, creating looks that referenced historical fashion while adapting to modern social contexts. These weren't traditional undergarments worn inappropriately. They were carefully designed external corsets that referenced historical silhouettes while functioning as contemporary fashion statements. The construction required adaptation of traditional corsetry techniques to create garments suitable for public wear and modern activities. The practical challenges were considerable. The structured garments restricted movement and breathing in ways that modern wearers weren't accustomed to. Activities had to be planned around the limitations imposed by the rigid construction. Sitting, bending, and reaching all required adjustment to accommodate the inflexible structure. The daily routine of wearing external corsetry required assistance and considerable time for proper fitting and adjustment. The garments had to be laced or fastened with precision to achieve the intended silhouette while maintaining reasonable comfort for extended wear. Yet the corset trend was embraced by fashion enthusiasts who saw it as empowering reclamation of historically restrictive garments. The visible structural elements were seen as honest representation of fashion's constructive processes, making visible the engineering that usually remained hidden. The social implications were complex and often controversial. The garments sparked discussions about historical fashion, female empowerment, and the relationship between restriction and beauty. Wearers became participants in ongoing cultural conversations about fashion, femininity, and personal agency. As we near the end of our gentle journey through fashion's most impractical moments, we find ourselves reflecting on the remarkable consistency of human willingness to prioritize aesthetic statement over physical comfort. Each generation has found new ways to challenge the basic relationship between clothing and the human form, creating innovations that seem designed to test the limits of adaptability and patience. The commitment required to maintain these elaborate fashion statements speaks to something fundamental about human creativity and social expression. Our ancestors and contemporaries alike have demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in finding new ways to transform the simple act of getting dressed into complex artistic and social statements. There's something deeply soothing about examining these choices as expressions of human creativity rather than simply impractical decisions. Each trend represents thousands of individuals making conscious choices to prioritize beauty, status, or artistic expression over convenience and comfort. The dedication required suggests a species-wide commitment to aesthetic experience that transcends practical considerations. The slow pace required by many of these fashion choices created different rhythms of daily life that seem almost meditative compared to our current emphasis on efficiency and speed. The patience required to dress in elaborate historical fashions, the mindful movement necessary to navigate in challenging footwear, the conscious awareness of space and form demanded by architectural clothing all suggest alternative relationships with time and physical presence. Perhaps what's most remarkable about these fashion phenomena is how they demonstrate the human capacity for adaptation and grace under constraint. People found ways to live full, meaningful lives while wearing clothing that severely limited their mobility, comfort, and practical capabilities. They developed new movement patterns, social conventions, and daily routines that accommodated the requirements of their chosen aesthetic statements. The social dynamics created by impractical fashion often fostered increased mindfulness and consideration in daily interactions. When simple movements became complex undertakings, when personal space requirements expanded dramatically, when basic activities required planning and assistance, social life necessarily became more deliberate and considered. As we conclude our exploration of these fascinating fashion choices, we're reminded that beauty and meaning often emerge from constraint rather than freedom. The elaborate rituals surrounding historical dress, the patience required to maintain impossible silhouettes, the creativity needed to function within restrictive garments, all speak to human capacity for finding grace and dignity under the most challenging circumstances. Those fashion trends, no matter how impractical they might seem to modern sensibilities, represent genuine human experiences of beauty, identity, and social connection. They remind us that the relationship between clothing and self-expression is complex and deeply personal, shaped by cultural values, social pressures, and individual creativity in ways that continue to evolve and surprise. The gentle pace we've maintained throughout this exploration mirrors the slower rhythms required by many of these historical fashion choices. There's something peaceful about contemplating these elaborate sartorial commitments without judgment, understanding them as products of their particular times and cultures, while appreciating the dedication and artistry they required. Perhaps that's the most fitting place to pause in our gentle journey through the curious corridors of fashion history. These trends, these moments of collective dedication to the impractical and the elaborate, offer us something more valuable than simple entertainment. They provide windows into the human soul, glimpses of our endless capacity to transform necessity into art, function into statement, the mundane into the magnificent. Tonight, as you settle into whatever comfortable, practical clothing awaits you, take a moment to appreciate the freedom of movement you possess. The ability to bend without calculating fabric stress, to walk without considering heel height, to breathe without architectural support. These simple freedoms, which we rarely notice, were luxuries our fashion-conscious ancestors willingly sacrificed in pursuit of beauty, status, and self-expression. There's something profoundly humbling about realizing that every generation believes its fashion choices are reasonable while viewing previous eras as incomprehensibly impractical. We look back at pointed shoes and laugh, yet our own closets likely contain items that future generations will find equally baffling. The human relationship with appearance and social signaling continues to evolve, but the underlying impulses remain remarkably consistent. The patience required by historical fashion choices speaks to a different relationship with time itself. When getting dressed required assistance and careful planning, when movement had to be considered and deliberate, when daily activities were constrained by clothing requirements, life necessarily moved at a more measured pace. There's something almost meditative about imagining such deliberate, mindful existence. Consider the morning rituals of our ancestors, the time spent arranging ruffs, positioning farthingales, lacing corsets, securing elaborate hairstyles. These weren't rushed, efficient processes, but slow, ceremonial preparations for public presentation. The act of getting dressed became a form of daily meditation, a quiet time for contemplation and preparation for the social performance ahead. The social dynamics created by elaborate historical fashion fostered different kinds of human interaction. When casual physical contact was prevented by architectural clothing, when movement was constrained by impractical accessories, when simple activities required assistance and planning, relationships necessarily became more formal, more considered, more intentionally intimate when intimacy was achieved. There's wisdom hidden in these seemingly absurd fashion choices. They remind us that beauty often emerges from constraint rather than freedom, that creativity flourishes when working within limitations, that the human capacity for adaptation and grace under difficult circumstances is truly remarkable. Our ancestors found ways to dance in platforms, to embrace in bustles, to work in corsets, to live fully while wearing clothing that seems designed to prevent normal function. The commitment shown to these fashion statements speaks to something fundamental about human nature, our willingness to endure discomfort for aesthetic effect, to reorganize daily life around appearance requirements, to find dignity and meaning within restrictive circumstances. These choices weren't made by a few eccentric individuals, but by entire societies, entire generations who collectively agreed that beauty justified inconvenience. Perhaps what's most soothing about examining these historical fashion choices is recognizing that the impulse towards self-expression through appearance is universal and enduring. Every culture, every era has found ways to transform basic clothing into elaborate statements of identity, status, creativity, and social belonging. The specific forms change, but the underlying human need to communicate through appearance remains constant. The slow pace we've maintained throughout this exploration reflects the natural rhythm required by many of these historical fashion choices. There's something peaceful about contemplating elaborate sartorial traditions without rushing, without judgment, simply allowing ourselves to appreciate the dedication and artistry they required. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of pointed shoes and platform boots, of ruffs and bustles, of all the remarkable ways humans have chosen to adorn themselves throughout history. These dreams might be filled with the sound of rustling fabric, the careful negotiation of doorways, the patient assistance of dressing rituals, the slow, deliberate movements required by architectural clothing. In those dreams, you might find yourself walking through centuries of fashion choices, each step measured and considered, each movement mindful of the elaborate constructions surrounding you. The pace would be gentle, unhurried, allowing time to appreciate the craftsmanship, the dedication, the sheer human creativity that transformed simple cloth into complex statements of identity and beauty. The gentle rhythm of this exploration, like the measured pace required by historical fashion, reminds us that not everything in life needs to be rushed or efficient. Sometimes, the most meaningful experiences come from slowing down, from taking time to appreciate complexity and nuance, from allowing ourselves to be present with the details that make each moment unique and valuable. These fashion trends, no matter how impractical they might appear to modern sensibilities, represent genuine human experiences of creativity, community, and self-expression. They remind us that the relationship between appearance and identity is complex and deeply personal, shaped by cultural values, technological limitations, and individual imagination in ways that continue to surprise and inspire. The dedication required to maintain these elaborate fashion statements suggests a species-wide commitment to aesthetic experience that transcends mere survival. Our ancestors chose beauty over comfort, art over efficiency, expression over convenience. These choices created communities bound together by shared aesthetic values, shared challenges, shared understanding of what beauty required and what it offered in return. As our journey through fashion's oddest moments draws toward its natural conclusion, we're left with appreciation for the remarkable consistency of human creativity and adaptability. Each generation has found new ways to challenge the basic relationship between clothing and comfort, creating innovations that test the limits of patience, balance, and social convention. The morning light filtering through your windows tomorrow will illuminate a world where fashion choices are largely practical, comfortable, and efficient. Yet somewhere in your closet, you likely have items that prioritize appearance over comfort, style over function. The impulse to transform clothing into statement continues, perhaps in more subtle forms, but with the same underlying human desire to communicate identity through appearance. The stories we've explored tonight remind us that fashion is never just about clothing. It's about community, about shared values, about the human need to belong while simultaneously expressing individuality. Every elaborate historical fashion trend represented thousands of people making conscious choices to participate in collective aesthetic experiences, to endure shared challenges in pursuit of shared beauty. There's something deeply comforting about recognizing that the human impulse towards self-expression through appearance has remained constant throughout history. The forms change, the specific requirements evolve, but the underlying need to communicate identity, status, creativity, and belonging through clothing choices persists across cultures and centuries. As you settle into sleep tonight, surrounded by the comfortable practicality of modern life, take a moment to appreciate the remarkable journey that brought us from pointed shoes to sneakers, from architectural corsets to stretch fabrics, from elaborate morning dress rituals to efficient modern routines. Each step of that journey was taken by real people making real choices about how they wanted to present themselves to the world. The gentle pace of our exploration tonight mirrors the slower rhythms of historical life, when time moved differently, when patience was necessity rather than luxury, when the simple act of getting dressed was ceremony rather than routine. In our efficient modern world, there's something almost revolutionary about slowing down, about taking time to appreciate complexity and craftsmanship, about allowing ourselves to be present with the details that make each moment rich with meaning and connection. These dreams of fashion's elaborate past might find you wandering through the cobblestone streets of Renaissance Europe, your feet encased in those impossibly pointed poulains, each step a calculated negotiation with gravity and grace. The sound of your footsteps would echo differently, slower, more deliberate, as you navigate around market stalls and fellow pedestrians, all moving with the same measured pace required by their elaborate attire. You might find yourself in a grand ballroom of the 18th century, your hair towering 3 feet above your head, carefully balanced and adorned with miniature ships and gardens. The other dancers move around you like slow-motion sculptures, each gesture planned, each turn executed with the precision of clockwork. The music plays at a tempo that accommodates architectural hairstyles, and conversations happen across the diameters of enormous skirts and elaborate headdresses. In these dreams, time moves like honey, thick and golden, allowing space for appreciation of every detail, every carefully constructed seam, every precisely placed pin. There's no rushing, no efficiency, just the pure experience of existing within these elaborate textile constructions that transform the human form into living art. Perhaps you'll dream of waking up in a Victorian mansion where getting dressed is a community effort involving multiple attendants, each with specialized knowledge of bustles, corsets, and the engineering required to create the day's silhouette. The morning ritual unfolds like a ceremony, each layer added with reverence, each adjustment made with the patience of craftspeople working on a masterpiece. The Victorian lady in your dream moves through her day with the grace of someone who has learned to find beauty within constraint. She navigates doorways sideways, arranges her skirts with practiced precision when sitting, and accepts the assistance of others, not as dependents, but as part of the elaborate social choreography required by her time. You might find yourself at a 1920s soiree, your dress constructed with geometric precision that makes sitting a strategic exercise and dancing a careful balance between movement and architectural integrity. The other guests move like living sculptures, their clothing maintaining perfect lines regardless of the wearer's actions, creating a scene that blurs the boundary between fashion and performance art. In the dream, these constraints don't feel restrictive, but rather like participation in a shared artistic vision. Every person becomes a collaborator in a vast aesthetic experiment, each choosing to prioritize beauty over convenience, art over efficiency, collective vision over individual comfort. The platform shoes of the 1970s appear in your dreams as instruments of meditation, each step requiring mindful attention, each movement an exercise in balance and grace. The wearers move like dancers performing on an invisible stage, their elevated height creating new perspectives on familiar spaces, their careful pace transforming ordinary activities into ceremonial acts. The business meetings of the 1980s unfold in your dreams with architectural precision as participants in power suits navigate around each other's extended shoulder lines like chess pieces on a three-dimensional board. Conversations happen across expanded personal space requirements, creating formality through simple physical presence. You might dream of the layered looks of the early 2000s, where getting dressed becomes an artistic process involving the careful coordination of multiple textures, colors, and silhouettes. Each layer is chosen not just for its individual merit, but for how it interacts with all the others, creating complexity that demands appreciation and understanding from both wearer and observer. The skinny jeans phenomenon appears in your dreams as a study in adaptation, watching people develop new movement patterns and daily routines that accommodate the restrictions while maintaining dignity and purpose. Every gesture becomes more deliberate, every activity more considered, creating a mindfulness that extends beyond clothing into general life awareness. In these fashion dreams, you witness the remarkable human capacity for finding grace within constraint, beauty within limitation, meaning within discomfort. Each historical moment represents thousands of individuals making conscious choices to participate in collective aesthetic experiences, to endure shared challenges in pursuit of shared beauty. The dreams might take you to fitting rooms across the centuries, where seamstresses and tailors work with the patience of architects, creating garments that will reshape not just appearance, but behavior, movement, and social interaction. These craftspeople understand that they're not just making clothing, but engineering new ways of being human, new relationships with space, time, and community. You witness the morning routines of centuries past, where preparation for public presentation requires hours of careful attention, skilled assistance, and absolute commitment to achieving the desired effect. These rituals unfold with ceremonial gravity, each step performed with the reverence accorded to sacred acts. The social gatherings in your dreams happen at the pace required by elaborate fashion, conversations unfolding with measured rhythm, dances choreographed around architectural clothing, intimate moments negotiated through layers of fabric and structure. The constraints create new forms of connection, new ways of expressing affection and respect. Perhaps you dream of the tiny bag trend, watching fashionable individuals navigate their days with accessories too small to hold anything useful, their commitment to aesthetic statement taking precedence over practical consideration. The obvious dysfunction becomes a shared joke, a form of social bonding through collective participation in beautiful absurdity. The corset as outerwear movement appears in your dreams as a conversation between past and present, historical restriction transformed into contemporary statement, internal structure made visible and celebrated rather than hidden and endured. The wearers move with consciousness of their constructed silhouettes, their posture altered by the garment's demands. Throughout these fashion dreams, you notice the remarkable consistency of human creativity and social expression. Each generation finds new ways to transform the basic relationship between body and clothing, creating innovations that challenge comfort while celebrating beauty, that prioritize statement over convenience. The dreams are filled with the sounds of fashion across the centuries, the rustling of enormous skirts navigating through doorways, the clicking of platform shoes on cobblestones, the whispered instructions of dressing attendants, the careful breathing of corseted wearers, the swishing of synthetic fabrics designed to move independently of the human form. You might find yourself in the workshops where these elaborate garments were created, watching craftspeople solve engineering problems with needle and thread, creating structural solutions for aesthetic challenges, developing new techniques for transforming cloth into architecture, fabric into statement, simple covering into complex communication. The patience visible in these dream workshops mirrors the patience required to wear the finished garments. Every stitch placed with consideration for how it will affect movement, every seam designed to accommodate the stresses of daily life while maintaining aesthetic integrity, every detail crafted with understanding that clothing shapes behavior as much as appearance. In your dreams, you witness the social rituals surrounding elaborate fashion, the assistance required for dressing and undressing, the planning necessary for simple activities, the adaptations made to furniture, architecture, and daily routines to accommodate clothing requirements. These aren't seen as burdens, but as natural accommodations for beauty, reasonable prices to pay for aesthetic achievement. The communities in your fashion dreams are bound together by shared understanding of beauty's requirements, shared patience with its demands, shared appreciation for its rewards. People help each other navigate doorways, adjust elaborate headdresses, manage unwieldy skirts, all with the casual grace of those who understand that beauty is a collective responsibility. You dream of the evolution of these fashion trends, watching as simple ideas become elaborate obsessions, as modest enhancements grow into architectural achievements, as practical clothing transforms into artistic statement. Each step of the evolution makes sense within its context, reasonable progression toward greater beauty, more dramatic effect, more complete transformation of the human silhouette. The seasonal changes in your fashion dreams create rhythms of preparation and adaptation. Spring bringing new silhouettes that require learning new movement patterns, summer demanding adjustments for heat while maintaining aesthetic integrity, autumn introducing layers that transform social dynamics, winter requiring engineering solutions for beauty in harsh conditions. Perhaps you dream of the merchants and traders who made these fashion trends possible, traveling great distances to bring exotic materials, unusual construction techniques, innovative design ideas from distant cultures. Their dedication enables the elaborate fashion experiments, their willingness to transport beauty across continents, making possible the collective aesthetic experiences. The children in your fashion dreams learn from observation and participation, absorbing the values and practices of their fashion-conscious societies, understanding from early age that appearance matters, that beauty requires sacrifice, that clothing communicates identity and status in complex, important ways. You witness the elderly in these dream societies, their lifelong experience with elaborate fashion creating grace and dignity in movement, wisdom in clothing choices, understanding of beauty's true costs, and genuine rewards. Their presence provides continuity, linking generations through shared aesthetic values and practices. The fashion dreams might take you to the moments of innovation, when creative individuals first imagined pointed shoes, architectural skirts, structural hairstyles, platform footwear. These moments of inspiration create the trends that will shape entire generations, influence social behavior, and challenge human adaptability. You dream of the resistance to fashion trends, the individuals who refuse to participate in collective aesthetic experiments, who prioritize comfort over beauty, practicality over statement. Their choices provide counterpoint to the mainstream trends, reminding dreamers that fashion participation is always choice, never necessity. The economic systems in your fashion dreams revolve around beauty production and maintenance. Entire industries devoted to creating, maintaining, and adapting elaborate clothing, skilled craftspeople whose livelihoods depend on society's commitment to aesthetic achievement, complex supply chains, bringing together materials and techniques from around the world. Perhaps you dream of the moments when fashion trends reach their peak elaboration, when pointed shoes become so long they require chains, when hairstyles grow so tall they require architectural support, when platform shoes reach heights that challenge basic mobility. These peak moments reveal both human creativity's limitless nature and its eventual collision with practical reality. The decline of fashion trends appears in your dreams as gradual recognition that beauty's costs have exceeded its benefits, that aesthetic achievement has become aesthetic burden, that collective commitment to elaborate fashion has reached natural limits. The transitions happen slowly, society gradually releasing its grip on particular forms of beauty while preparing to embrace new ones. Your fashion dreams are filled with mirrors, reflecting the elaborate silhouettes created by historical clothing, showing wearers how their choices transform their appearance, their presence, their relationship with space and movement. These reflections become part of identity formation, ways of understanding self through aesthetic achievement. The traveling in your fashion dreams happens at the pace required by elaborate clothing, journeys planned around the limitations and requirements of architectural fashion, accommodations made for clothing that transforms simple movement into complex undertaking. Distance becomes less important than the dignity and grace with which it's covered. You might dream of the festivals and celebrations where elaborate fashion reaches its fullest expression, entire communities gathering to display their commitment to beauty, their skill in aesthetic achievement, their participation in collective artistic vision. These gatherings become showcases for human creativity and social coordination. The dreams show you the daily heroism of people who choose beauty over comfort, who accept restriction as the price of aesthetic achievement, who find grace and dignity within the most challenging circumstances. Their commitment reveals something essential about human nature, about our species-wide dedication to beauty, meaning, and self-expression. As these fashion dreams begin to fade with approaching dawn, you're left with deeper appreciation for the remarkable consistency of human aesthetic impulses. Every generation has found ways to transform basic clothing into elaborate statement, to challenge the relationship between comfort and beauty, to create communities bound together by shared commitment to aesthetic achievement. The morning light filtering through your windows illuminates a world where these elaborate fashion traditions have evolved into more practical forms, where the human impulse toward aesthetic expression continues but within more comfortable parameters. Yet the dreams remind you that the underlying drives remain constant. The need to communicate identity through appearance, to participate in collective beauty, to transform necessity into art. In the gentle transition from dream to waking, you carry with you the patience of historical fashion, the mindfulness required by elaborate clothing, the appreciation for beauty that justifies inconvenience. These qualities from fashion's elaborate past offer wisdom for contemporary life, reminding us that sometimes the most meaningful experiences require slowing down, paying attention, accepting constraint as the price of beauty. The rhythm of these fashion dreams mirrors the natural pace of appreciation, the time required to understand complexity, to value craftsmanship, to recognize the dedication embedded in elaborate aesthetic achievement. In our efficient modern world, this slower pace becomes almost revolutionary, a reminder that not everything valuable can be rushed or simplified. As consciousness fully returns and the dreams fade into memory, you're left with gratitude for the remarkable journey of human fashion expression, for the creativity and dedication of countless individuals who chose beauty over convenience, art over efficiency, collective aesthetic experience over individual comfort. Their choices created the rich tapestry of fashion history that continues to inspire, challenge, and amaze us. The comfortable clothes waiting in your closet represent the evolution of this long fashion journey, practical garments that incorporate lessons learned from centuries of aesthetic experimentation. Yet somewhere among these practical choices, you likely have items that prioritize appearance over comfort, that connect you to the eternal human impulse toward self-expression through clothing. Today, as you move through the world in your practical, comfortable attire, you carry with you the dreams of fashion's elaborate past, the patience of historical beauty, the appreciation for aesthetic achievement that transcends mere survival. These qualities enrich your experience of contemporary life, adding depth and meaning to the simple act of getting dressed. The gentle conclusion of our journey through fashion's oddest moments leaves us with profound appreciation for human creativity, adaptability, and commitment to beauty. Each elaborate trend we've explored represents thousands of real people making conscious choices about appearance, identity, and social participation, their dedication creating the rich historical tapestry that continues to influence and inspire us. In the quiet moments before sleep finally claims you, there's something deeply peaceful about recognizing that the human impulse toward beauty and self-expression is eternal, constant across cultures and centuries, manifesting in ever-changing forms, but driven by unchanging needs for identity, community, and meaning. These fashion dreams remind us that we are part of this ongoing story, contributors to the continuing evolution of human aesthetic expression. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the gentle rhythm of historical fashion, the patient craftsmanship of dedicated artisans, the quiet dignity of people who chose beauty over convenience, and the timeless human capacity for finding grace within constraint, meaning within limitation, and community within shared commitment to aesthetic achievement. The late 2020s brought us perhaps the most psychologically demanding fashion trend in recent memory, the deliberately uncomfortable shoe movement. These weren't just poorly designed footwear, they were engineered specifically to create discomfort as an aesthetic statement. Shoes with intentionally uneven soles deliberately placed pressure points and strategic instability that transformed every step into a conscious act of endurance. The philosophy behind this trend was complex and somewhat unsettling. Proponents argued that comfort had made us soft, that ease of movement disconnected us from our physical selves. The uncomfortable shoes were designed to restore awareness to walking, to make every step a mindful decision rather than an automatic function. The construction of these shoes required remarkable innovation in reverse engineering. Designers had to calculate exactly how much discomfort could be introduced while maintaining basic safety and functionality. The balance between challenging and dangerous required constant refinement and testing by volunteers willing to endure considerable foot pain in the name of aesthetic philosophy. The daily experience of wearing such footwear transformed simple activities into exercises in determination and focus. Walking to work became a meditation on persistence. Climbing stairs required genuine mental preparation. Even standing still demanded active engagement with balance and weight distribution in ways that modern humans had forgotten. Yet the appeal of this challenging footwear was undeniable among those who embraced discomfort as a path to greater awareness and authenticity. The obvious impracticality was seen as liberation from the tyranny of comfort, a rejection of the ease that supposedly weakened both body and character. The social dynamics created by deliberately uncomfortable shoes were fascinating to observe. Wearers moved with increased mindfulness and intention. Conversations often included references to the footwear experience, creating bonds between those who shared the commitment to aesthetic discomfort. The shoes became symbols of dedication to philosophical principles rather than mere fashion accessories. There's something oddly meditative about imagining daily life conducted with such conscious attention to every step. The enforced mindfulness created by uncomfortable footwear transformed routine movement into deliberate practice, turning sidewalks into paths of contemplation and stairs into opportunities for focused determination. As we move into the present era, we encounter fashion trends that seem to blend ancient practices with contemporary technology in ways that create entirely new forms of aesthetic challenge. The smart clothing movement introduced garments embedded with sensors, displays, and responsive materials that reacted to environmental conditions, biometric data, and social media activity in real time. These weren't simply clothes with added technology. They were living garments that changed color based on heart rate, displayed social media notifications across fabric surfaces, and adjusted their fit and temperature according to algorithmic interpretation of the wearer's emotional state and social calendar. The practical challenges were immediate and complex. The garments required daily charging, regular software updates, and careful maintenance to prevent technological malfunctions that could leave the wearer partially or completely exposed. The integration of electronics with textiles created new vulnerabilities to water, heat, and physical stress. The daily routine of wearing smart clothing required technological literacy and constant awareness of system status. Battery levels had to be monitored throughout the day. Software glitches could cause embarrassing display malfunctions or uncomfortable temperature irregularities. The wearer became responsible for maintaining not just the appearance of their clothing, but its technological functionality. The social implications were equally complex. The reactive nature of smart clothing made private emotions and biological responses visible to observers. Heart rate spikes, stress indicators, and mood fluctuations became part of the outfit's visual presentation, creating new forms of social transparency that challenged traditional boundaries between private and public self. Yet the smart clothing trend was embraced by technology enthusiasts who saw it as evolution toward more responsive and personalized fashion. The integration of clothing with digital life was seen as natural progression, eliminating the boundaries between physical and virtual presentation. The privacy concerns raised by smart clothing created ongoing debates about the appropriate level of technological integration in personal appearance. The garments collected vast amounts of biometric and behavioral data, raising questions about who had access to this information and how it might be used. Moving deeper into contemporary fashion experimentation, we encounter trends that seem designed to challenge basic assumptions about clothing permanence and ownership. The biodegradable fashion movement created garments designed to decompose within specific time frames, transforming clothing from durable goods into temporary experiences. These weren't simply poorly made clothes that fell apart quickly. They were engineered to decompose in controlled ways that created aesthetic experiences through decay. Some garments were designed to change color and texture as they broke down, creating unique visual evolution for each wearer. Others incorporated seeds that would sprout as the fabric decomposed, transforming discarded clothing into garden installations. The practical challenges were considerable. Wearers had to plan their wardrobe around decomposition schedules, carefully timing when each garment would begin its decay process. Storage required special conditions to prevent premature decomposition. The unpredictable nature of biological processes meant that garments might begin breaking down at inconvenient moments. The daily experience of wearing biodegradable clothing required acceptance of impermanence and change as fundamental aspects of fashion. The knowledge that each outfit was temporary created different relationships with clothing, emphasizing experience over possession, process over product. The social dynamics were equally interesting. Biodegradable fashion created communities focused on sharing, exchanging, and collaborative creation rather than individual ownership. The temporary nature of the garments encouraged more experimental choices and reduced attachment to specific pieces. Yet the biodegradable movement attracted individuals committed to environmental sustainability and philosophical acceptance of impermanence. The decomposing garments were seen as honest representation of fashion's environmental impact and natural life cycle processes. The economic implications were significant, challenging traditional models of fashion production and consumption. Biodegradable clothing required new approaches to pricing, distribution, and customer relationships based on temporary rather than permanent ownership. As we continue exploring contemporary fashion's more experimental edges, we encounter trends that seem to prioritize psychological impact over physical appearance. The invisibility fashion movement created garments designed to make wearers less visible rather than more attractive, using advanced materials and optical techniques to reduce visual presence. These weren't camouflage patterns or neutral colors. They were sophisticated optical systems that bent light around the wearer or created visual confusion that made accurate perception difficult. The technology borrowed from military stealth research but applied it to civilian fashion for aesthetic and philosophical purposes. The practical challenges were immediate and often dangerous. Reduced visibility made the wearer less noticeable to vehicles, other pedestrians, and emergency responders. Simple activities like crossing streets or navigating crowded spaces became hazardous when others couldn't easily see or track the wearer's movement. The daily logistics of wearing invisibility fashion required constant awareness of safety considerations and social context. Wearers had to plan their activities around visibility requirements, switching to more conventional clothing for situations requiring clear visual presence. The social implications were profound and often unsettling. The ability to reduce one's visual impact challenged fundamental assumptions about social interaction, personal responsibility, and public space navigation. Conversations about consent, privacy, and social obligation arose around fashion that enabled partial invisibility. Yet the invisibility trend attracted individuals interested in exploring themes of presence, attention, and social visibility. The garments were seen as commentary on contemporary attention economy and the pressure for constant visual performance in social media culture. The philosophical questions raised by invisibility fashion extended beyond mere clothing choices to fundamental issues of identity, social responsibility, and the relationship between appearance and existence in contemporary society. Moving into the realm of fashion's most psychologically complex recent developments, we encounter trends that seem designed to challenge the wearer's sense of physical reality and spatial awareness. The disorientation fashion movement created garments that deliberately confused the wearer's proprioception and spatial understanding through asymmetrical weights, shifting balance points, and materials that moved independently of body motion. These weren't simply unbalanced or poorly constructed clothes. They were engineered to create specific forms of physical confusion that forced increased body awareness and challenged automatic movement patterns. The garments included hidden weights that shifted unexpectedly, fabrics that moved contrary to body motion, and structural elements that created false sensations of support or restriction. The practical challenges were considerable and potentially dangerous. Wearers had to develop new movement strategies to compensate for the garment's disorienting effects. Simple activities like walking, sitting, or reaching for objects required conscious recalculation of spatial relationships and balance requirements. The daily experience of wearing disorientation fashion demanded extraordinary mental focus and physical adaptation. Every movement required conscious attention to the garment's unpredictable behavior. The enforced awareness created a heightened state of bodily consciousness that proponents claimed enhanced mindfulness and presence. The social dynamics were equally complex. Wearers moved through spaces with obvious uncertainty and deliberation that affected others' perception and interaction patterns. The visible struggle with basic movement created empathy, concern, or curiosity depending on observers' understanding of the intentional nature of the challenge. Yet the disorientation trend attracted individuals interested in exploring altered states of consciousness and challenging habitual patterns of physical existence. The confusion was seen as liberation from automatic behavior and opportunity for increased self-awareness. The psychological implications were significant, raising questions about the relationship between physical comfort and mental clarity, between easy movement and conscious presence, between bodily confidence and spiritual development. As we approach the most recent developments in fashion's experimental frontiers, we encounter trends that seem to dissolve the boundaries between clothing and environment, between personal adornment and architectural space. The environmental integration fashion movement created garments that responded to and interacted with surrounding spaces in ways that made the distinction between clothing and environment increasingly unclear. These garments incorporated materials and technologies that changed properties based on atmospheric conditions, lighting, sound levels, and proximity to other objects or people. The clothing became environmental sensors that translated surrounding conditions into visual, tactile, or even auditory experiences for both wearer and observers. The construction required integration of textiles with environmental monitoring systems, responsive materials, and communication technologies. The garments became complex interfaces between human body and surrounding space, constantly interpreting and responding to environmental data. The practical challenges were substantial. The garments required calibration for different environments and frequent maintenance to ensure proper sensor function. Weather changes, lighting variations, and acoustic conditions could trigger unexpected responses that might be uncomfortable or socially inappropriate. The daily experience of wearing environmentally integrated fashion required acceptance of unpredictability and constant change. The wearer became a walking environmental display, their clothing constantly shifting in response to conditions beyond their control. The social implications were fascinating and often overwhelming. The garments created new forms of social interaction based on environmental response rather than personal choice. Conversations might be interrupted by clothing reacting to sound levels, while intimate moments could trigger unwanted visual displays. Yet the environmental integration movement attracted individuals interested in exploring deeper connections between human presence and surrounding space. The responsive clothing was seen as bridge between individual identity and environmental awareness. The philosophical questions raised by environmentally integrated fashion touched on fundamental issues of autonomy, privacy, and the relationship between self and environment in an increasingly connected world. As our exploration of fashion's most curious contemporary developments continues, we find ourselves contemplating trends that seem to challenge the very concept of individual ownership and personal identity in clothing. The collective consciousness fashion movement created garments that were designed to be worn simultaneously by multiple people, requiring cooperation and coordination for basic dressing and movement. These weren't simply large clothes that could accommodate multiple wearers. They were engineered connection systems that required specific numbers of people in precise positions to function properly. The garments included shared sleeves, interconnected support systems, and coordinated closure mechanisms that made individual wear impossible. The practical challenges were immediate and complex. Getting dressed required scheduling and coordination among multiple participants. Basic activities like walking, sitting, or eating demanded constant communication and compromise among connected wearers. The daily logistics of collective fashion required social planning and group commitment that extended far beyond simple clothing choices. Work schedules, meal times, and personal needs had to be coordinated among all connected participants. The social dynamics were unprecedented in fashion history. The garments forced intimate cooperation among wearers who might be strangers, friends, or family members. Personal boundaries became negotiable elements in shared aesthetic experiences. Yet the collective fashion movement attracted communities interested in exploring alternatives to individualistic culture and personal ownership models. The shared garments were seen as vehicles for building deeper social connections and challenging assumptions about personal space and individual identity. The psychological implications were profound, forcing participants to negotiate autonomy within interdependence, personal expression within group coordination, individual comfort within collective aesthetic achievement. Moving toward the absolute cutting edge of contemporary fashion experimentation, we encounter trends that seem to exist primarily in theoretical or digital spaces, rather than physical reality. The virtual fashion movement created garments that existed only as digital representations, experienced through augmented reality interfaces, rather than physical wear. These weren't simply digital clothing for avatars or video game characters. They were sophisticated virtual garments designed to be experienced as real clothing through advanced sensory technologies, including haptic feedback, thermal simulation, and even olfactory components. The construction existed entirely in digital space, using advanced modeling techniques to create realistic fabric behavior, lighting interaction, and movement dynamics. The virtual garments could be more elaborate and physically impossible than any physical clothing, while providing sensory experiences that mimicked real wear. The practical challenges involved technology adoption and sensory adaptation rather than physical comfort or movement restriction. Wearers needed access to expensive virtual reality equipment and willingness to accept digital sensations as substitute for physical experience. The daily experience of wearing virtual fashion required suspension of traditional assumptions about clothing reality. The garments existed only during virtual reality sessions, but provided experiences that users reported as satisfying as physical clothing wear. The social implications were revolutionary, creating new forms of fashion consumption, display, and sharing that existed independently of physical production, shipping, or storage. Virtual fashion weeks allowed global participation without travel, while digital wardrobes eliminated storage and maintenance concerns. Yet the virtual fashion movement attracted individuals comfortable with digital lifestyle integration and philosophical acceptance of virtual experience as legitimate reality. The digital garments were seen as liberation from physical limitations and environmental impact of traditional fashion production. The economic implications were substantial, creating new models of fashion creation, distribution, and consumption based on digital rather than physical goods, subscription rather than ownership, and experience rather than possession. As we near the conclusion of our gentle journey through fashion's most experimental contemporary developments, we find ourselves contemplating trends that seem to exist at the very boundaries of what might be considered clothing at all. The energy fashion movement created garments composed entirely of controlled energy fields, light patterns, and electromagnetic effects rather than traditional materials. These weren't costumes with added lighting effects. They were sophisticated energy manipulation systems that created the visual and even tactile sensations of clothing without any physical material. The technology involved controlled holographic projection, electromagnetic field manipulation, and targeted energy delivery to create convincing sensory experiences. The construction existed at the intersection of fashion design and advanced physics, requiring teams of engineers, artists, and theoretical scientists to create stable energy patterns that could function as wearable garments. The development costs were enormous and the technical requirements extraordinary. The practical challenges involved energy supply, field stability, and safety considerations around prolonged exposure to controlled electromagnetic effects. Wearers needed portable power systems and monitoring equipment to ensure safe operation of their energy garments. The daily experience of wearing energy fashion required acceptance of completely new relationships between body and clothing, presence and appearance, substance and effect. The garments existed as pure visual and sensory phenomena without traditional material properties. The social implications were mind-bending, creating new categories of fashion experience that challenged fundamental assumptions about clothing, materials, and physical presence. Energy fashion existed in spaces where technology, art, and philosophy intersected in unprecedented ways. Yet the energy fashion movement attracted visionaries interested in exploring the absolute frontiers of human aesthetic experience and technological integration. The energy garments were seen as glimpses into post-material future where human expression transcended physical limitations. The philosophical questions raised by energy fashion touched the deepest issues of reality, materiality, and the relationship between consciousness and physical experience in an increasingly digital and technologically mediated world. As our exploration of fashion's most curious and challenging developments draws toward its natural close, we find ourselves reflecting on the remarkable consistency of human creativity and the endless capacity for finding new ways to transform the basic relationship between body, clothing, and identity. From the pointed shoes of medieval Europe to the energy fields of contemporary fashion laboratories, each generation has discovered innovative methods for challenging comfort, convention, and the assumed boundaries of what clothing can be and do. The commitment shown to these experimental forms speaks to something fundamental about human nature and our species-wide dedication to aesthetic experience. The gentle pace we've maintained throughout this exploration reflects the natural rhythm required for appreciating complexity and nuance in fashion's most challenging expressions. There's something peaceful about contemplating these elaborate aesthetic experiments without rushing to judgment, allowing ourselves time to understand the dedication and vision they represent. These contemporary fashion movements, like their historical predecessors, create communities bound together by shared commitment to aesthetic exploration and willingness to accept discomfort, inconvenience, or even danger in pursuit of new forms of beauty and self-expression. The evolution continues, driven by the same fundamental human impulses that created pointed shoes and platform boots. The morning light that will soon filter through your windows illuminates a world where these experimental fashion trends exist alongside more practical clothing choices, where the human impulse toward aesthetic innovation continues to push boundaries while serving the basic needs of daily life. The balance between innovation and practicality shifts constantly, creating the ongoing tension that drives fashion evolution. In the gentle transition towards sleep, you carry with you appreciation for the remarkable journey of human fashion expression, from the most practical survival clothing to the most abstract energy fields, all representing the endless human capacity for transforming necessity into art, function into statement, the mundane into the magnificent. The comfortable clothes waiting in your closet tomorrow represent just one moment in this ongoing evolution, practical choices that incorporate lessons learned from centuries of aesthetic experimentation while pointing toward future innovations we can barely imagine. Yet somewhere among these practical items, you likely have pieces that connect you to fashion's experimental spirit. The rhythm of fashion innovation continues, driven by the same human needs for identity, beauty, community, and self-expression that have motivated every generation to challenge the boundaries of what clothing can be and do. Each new development, no matter how impractical it might seem, represents genuine human creativity and the endless desire to transform appearance into meaning. As consciousness fades and dreams begin to form, you may find yourself walking through the corridors of fashion's possible futures, wearing garments that exist only in imagination, moving through worlds where clothing transcends every limitation we currently understand, where beauty and identity merge in ways we haven't yet discovered. These dreams of fashion's future might be filled with materials we can't name, construction techniques we can't imagine, and aesthetic experiences that challenge every assumption about the relationship between human consciousness and physical appearance. The pace will be gentle, unhurried, allowing time to appreciate innovation without rushing toward judgment or practical application. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the endless creativity of human fashion expression, the patient innovation of dedicated designers, the quiet courage of experimental wearers, and the timeless human capacity for finding beauty within constraint, meaning within limitation, and community within shared commitment to aesthetic achievement that transcends mere survival. In the gentle darkness before dawn, fashion's strange and wonderful journey continues, carried forward by dreamers, innovators, and the eternal human conviction that how we present ourselves to the world matters deeply, that clothing can be more than covering, that appearance can transcend mere function to become art, statement, and bridge between inner vision and outer expression. The story of fashion's oddest trends reminds us that beauty often emerges from the most unexpected places, that innovation frequently begins with ideas that seem impossible or impractical, and that the human capacity for adaptation and grace under aesthetic constraint remains one of our most remarkable and enduring characteristics. The story continues to unfold across centuries of human aesthetic expression, each chapter more curious than the last. And perhaps that's the most fitting place to rest in our gentle journey through fashion's elaborate corridors. These trends, these moments of collective dedication to the impractical and the extraordinary, offer us something more valuable than simple entertainment or historical curiosity. They provide windows into the human soul, glimpses of our endless capacity to transform necessity into art, function into statement, the mundane into the magnificent. Throughout our exploration tonight, we've witnessed the remarkable consistency of human creativity and the enduring impulse to communicate identity through appearance. From pointed shoes that required chains to prevent tripping, to energy fields that exist only as controlled light. Each generation has found new ways to challenge the basic relationship between body and clothing, comfort and beauty, practicality and artistic vision. There's something profoundly humbling about realizing that every era believes its fashion choices are reasonable while viewing previous generations as incomprehensibly impractical. We look back at ruffs and bustles and platform boots and shake our heads in amazement, yet our own closets likely contain items that future generations will find equally baffling. The human relationship with appearance and social signaling continues to evolve, but the underlying impulses remain remarkably constant across cultures and centuries. Well, the patience required by many of these historical fashion choices speaks to a fundamentally different relationship with time itself. When getting dressed required assistance and careful planning, when movement had to be considered and deliberate, when daily activities were constrained by clothing requirements, life necessarily moved at a more measured pace. There's something almost meditative about imagining such deliberate, mindful existence, where the simple act of walking became a conscious practice rather than an automatic function. Consider the social dynamics created by these elaborate fashion statements. When casual physical contact was prevented by architectural clothing, when movement was constrained by impractical accessories, when simple activities required assistance and planning, relationships necessarily became more formal, more considered, more intentionally intimate when intimacy was achieved. The constraints created new forms of human connection, new ways of expressing affection and respect within the limitations imposed by aesthetic choices. Perhaps what's most remarkable about these fashion phenomena is how they demonstrate the human capacity for adaptation and grace under constraint. People found ways to live full, meaningful lives while wearing clothing that severely limited their mobility, comfort, and practical capabilities. They developed new movement patterns, social conventions, and daily routines that accommodated the requirements of their chosen aesthetic statements, transforming limitations into opportunities for creativity and mindfulness. The commitment shown to these fashion statements, generation after generation, speaks to something fundamental about human nature: our willingness to endure discomfort for aesthetic effect, to reorganize daily life around appearance requirements, to find dignity and meaning within restrictive circumstances. These choices weren't made by a few eccentric individuals, but by entire societies, entire generations who collectively agreed that beauty justified inconvenience, that self-expression warranted sacrifice. The gentle pace we've maintained throughout this exploration reflects the natural rhythm required by many of these historical fashion choices. There's something peaceful about contemplating elaborate sartorial traditions without rushing, without judgment, simply allowing ourselves to appreciate the dedication and artistry they required. In our efficient modern world, this slower pace becomes almost revolutionary, a reminder that not everything valuable can be rushed or simplified. As you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of pointed shoes and platform boots, of ruffs and bustles, of energy fields and biodegradable fabrics, of all the remarkable ways humans have chosen to adorn themselves throughout history. These dreams might be filled with the sound of rustling fabric, the careful negotiation of doorways, the patient assistance of dressing rituals, the slow, deliberate movements required by architectural clothing. In those dreams, you might find yourself walking through centuries of fashion choices, each step measured and considered, each movement mindful of the elaborate constructions surrounding you. The pace would be gentle, unhurried, allowing time to appreciate the craftsmanship, the dedication, the sheer human creativity that transformed simple cloth into complex statements of identity and beauty. The morning light filtering through your windows tomorrow will illuminate a world where fashion choices are largely practical, comfortable, and efficient. Yet somewhere in your closet, you likely have items that prioritize appearance over comfort, style over function. The impulse to transform clothing into statement continues, perhaps in more subtle forms, but with the same underlying human desire to communicate identity through appearance. These fashion trends, no matter how impractical they might appear to modern sensibilities, represent genuine human experiences of creativity, community, and self-expression. They remind us that the relationship between appearance and identity is complex and deeply personal, shaped by cultural values, technological possibilities, and individual imagination in ways that continue to surprise and inspire. The dedication required to maintain these elaborate fashion statements suggests a species-wide commitment to aesthetic experience that transcends mere survival. Our ancestors chose beauty over comfort, art over efficiency, expression over convenience. These choices created communities bound together by shared aesthetic values, shared challenges, shared understanding of what beauty required and what it offered in return. Sleep well tonight, surrounded by the comfortable practicality of modern life, and take a moment to appreciate the remarkable journey that brought us from pointed shoes to sneakers, from architectural corsets to stretch fabrics, from elaborate morning dress rituals to efficient modern routines. Each step of that journey was taken by real people making real choices about how they wanted to present themselves to the world. The stories we've explored remind us that fashion is never just about clothing. It's about community, about shared values, about the human need to belong while simultaneously expressing individuality. Every elaborate historical fashion trend represented thousands of people making conscious choices to participate in collective aesthetic experiences, to endure shared challenges in pursuit of shared beauty. As consciousness fades and dreams begin to form, you carry with you the gentle rhythm of historical fashion, the patient craftsmanship of dedicated artisans, the quiet dignity of people who chose beauty over convenience, and the timeless human capacity for finding grace within constraint, meaning within limitation, and community within shared commitment to aesthetic achievement. The human impulse toward beauty and self-expression is eternal, constant across cultures and centuries, manifesting in ever-changing forms, but driven by unchanging needs for identity, community, and meaning. These fashion dreams remind us that we are part of this ongoing story, contributors to the continuing evolution of human aesthetic expression. In the gentle darkness before dawn, fashion's strange and wonderful journey continues, carried forward by dreamers, innovators, and the eternal human conviction that how we present ourselves to the world matters deeply, that clothing can be more than covering, that appearance can transcend mere function to become art, statement, and bridge between inner vision and outer expression. The rhythm of fashion innovation continues, driven by the same human needs that motivated our ancestors to endure pointed shoes and platform boots, to embrace corsets and bustles, to accept discomfort as the price of beauty. Each new development represents genuine human creativity and the endless desire to transform appearance into meaning, necessity into art, the simple act of getting dressed into an elaborate statement of who we are and who we aspire to become. Rest peacefully now, knowing that tomorrow you'll wake to a world where these elaborate fashion traditions have evolved into more practical forms, where the human impulse toward aesthetic expression continues but within more comfortable parameters. Yet the dreams remind you that the underlying drives remain constant. The need to communicate identity through appearance, to participate in collective beauty, to transform necessity into art. And perhaps that's the most beautiful thing about fashion's long, strange journey through human history. It reminds us that even in our most practical moments, even when we choose comfort over spectacle and efficiency over elaboration, we carry within us the same creative impulse that drove our ancestors to endure pointed shoes and architectural corsets, to embrace platform boots and biodegradable fabrics. The thread that connects the medieval peasant, lacing up his poulains, to the contemporary influencer, adjusting her smart clothing, is unbroken. It's the thread of human desire to communicate something essential about ourselves through what we wear, to say without words who we are, where we belong, what we value, and how we see ourselves in relation to the world around us. Tonight, as you settle into whatever comfortable, practical clothing awaits you, take a moment to appreciate not just the freedom of movement you possess, but the connection you share with every person throughout history who has ever stood before a mirror or a reflection in water or the polished surface of a shield and made conscious choices about how to present themselves to the world. The gentle rhythm of our exploration tonight mirrors something essential about fashion itself. The way trends emerge slowly, build gradually, reach their peak of elaborate expression, and then fade into memory, leaving behind only traces in museum collections and the occasional revival. There's a natural breathing pattern to fashion's evolution, an inhale of innovation and an exhale of reflection, a constant cycle of experimentation and adaptation. In the quiet moments before sleep claims you, consider the remarkable fact that somewhere in the world tonight, designers are sketching ideas that would seem as impossible to us as energy clothing seemed to our great-grandparents. Someone is experimenting with materials we haven't named yet, construction techniques we can't imagine, aesthetic experiences that will challenge every assumption we currently hold about the relationship between human consciousness and physical appearance. The story continues, carried forward by the same fundamental human impulses that created every fashion trend we've explored tonight. The desire to be seen, to be understood, to belong, to stand out, to communicate identity through the simple but profound act of choosing what to wear. These impulses are as constant as breathing, as essential as heartbeat, as enduring as the human capacity for creativity and self-expression. And in the end, perhaps that's the most soothing thing of all, to know that no matter how much the world changes, no matter what technologies emerge or disappear, no matter what challenges or opportunities the future brings, humans will continue to find new ways to transform the basic necessity of covering their bodies into elaborate statements of beauty, identity, and hope. The comfortable clothes you'll put on tomorrow morning are part of this ongoing story, practical choices that nonetheless carry within them the accumulated wisdom of centuries of aesthetic experimentation. And somewhere among your most sensible garments, you probably have at least one item that makes you feel a little more beautiful, a little more confident, a little more like the person you aspire to be. That item, however modest, connects you to the eternal human tradition of using clothing to bridge the gap between who you are and who you dream of becoming. Sleep well, knowing that the thread connecting you to every pointed shoe wearer, every bustle navigator, every platform boot balancer stretches unbroken across the centuries. In your dreams tonight, you might find yourself walking those cobblestone streets in impossible footwear, moving with the measured grace that elaborate fashion demanded, feeling the weight of architectural clothing and the patience it required. The gentle rhythm of breathing that will carry you into sleep mirrors the natural pace of fashion's evolution itself. The way trends emerge like whispered suggestions, grow into collective obsessions, reach peaks of elaborate impossibility, then fade into fond memory. There's something deeply comforting about this cycle, this constant human desire to reinvent beauty, to challenge comfort, to transform the mundane act of getting dressed into something approaching art. Perhaps in those dreams, you'll discover that the real magic wasn't in the pointed shoes or the platform boots, the corsets or the bustles, the energy fields or the biodegradable fabrics. The real magic was in the human capacity to find grace within constraint, beauty within limitation, dignity within discomfort. The ability to look at a piece of cloth and imagine it transformed into statement, story, identity. Tomorrow morning, as you reach for whatever practical, comfortable clothing awaits you, remember that you're participating in the same fundamental human ritual that has connected every generation. The simple act of choosing what to wear, of presenting yourself to the world, of using appearance to communicate something essential about who you are and who you hope to become. The comfortable shoes you'll slip on will carry you through your day with ease our ancestors could barely imagine. The practical garments you'll wear will move with you, breathe with you, support you without demanding the constant mindfulness that historical fashion required. Yet somewhere in the simple act of getting dressed, you'll be participating in the same eternal human conversation about beauty, identity, and self-expression that drove people to endure pointed shoes and platform boots, architectural corsets, and energy fields. Rest peacefully now, surrounded by the gentle knowledge that fashion's strange and wonderful journey continues, that human creativity and the desire for beauty remain as constant as starlight, as enduring as the rhythm of your own breathing, as it carries you gently towards sleep and dreams of all the remarkable ways humans have chosen to adorn themselves across the centuries. The morning will bring practical choices and comfortable movement, but tonight belongs to the dreamers and innovators, the pointed shoe wearers and platform boot balancers, all the brave souls who chose beauty over convenience and left us this rich, strange, wonderful legacy of human creativity and the eternal desire to transform necessity into art. Sweet dreams of fashion's gentle mysteries, and may you wake tomorrow with deeper appreciation for both the comfort of modern clothing and the enduring human spirit that continues to find new ways to make the simple act of getting dressed into something beautiful, meaningful, and uniquely human.